In today's webcast, this is going to be a continuation of some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. As many of you know, in 2021 was the first time we did this webcast to try to introduce some of the changes and differences and really understanding some of the different cybersecurity standards that are available today. Today's webcast really is going to be a follow-up to some of that research, and it's going to be the latest view of what we have today, looking at the state of these standards and what we can learn from some of those. So what we're going to do is I'm going to present a lot of information today. And really in the time that we have allowed, there's only so much that we're going to be able to get through. At the end of this presentation, we are going to go ahead and post this information, the entire slide deck. It'll be available up at SANS.org. So please take the time to read through that and get into more detail. As we go through today, if you have questions, please let us know. As Laura mentioned, put it in Q&A. We'll answer as many questions as we can. But then likely at the end of this, there's going to be more information, probably more than we have time for. So please feel free to send us more questions. We'll be more than happy to interact. We're really just hoping to get this information out to give you the best information possible. Just again, a little bit of background on me too. I've had the opportunity of working in cybersecurity space about 25 years now. And I've worked with a lot of different groups like the SANS Institute, and others, just to be able to do a lot of teaching, instruction, and research. One of the projects that I'd spent quite a few years on was working with the Center for Net Security on the CIS Controls, helping edit some of those documents for quite a few years, since about maybe 2008 or so. And recently, over the last couple of years, we spent a lot of our time, really since the beginning of the pandemic, looking at a larger view, sort of an aggregate view of cybersecurity standards, and really trying to understand some of the differences, some of the edits, some of the nuances between these, and really helping organizations to decide what are those controls or safeguards that are most appropriate in an enterprise. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about some of the research we've been working on. We'll talk a little bit about the collective project that I've been working on the last couple of years with my team, and really try to get you some introductions to some of those. For the sake of my OCD and just being able to stay focused, I'm going to go ahead and stop video for right now. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and focus on the slides just to keep everybody focused here today. So the reality, I think, of what we realized today is that today there are literally dozens of cybersecurity standards. Now, it might be too much to say that there are hundreds of standards, but there are probably a good 50 to maybe 100 standards that are really widely used around the world today. A lot of these are going to be industry specific. You're seeing more and more statutes come out sort of at a state level, or individual governments around the world. More and more countries around the world are starting to put cybersecurity standards in place. You have standard setting bodies, things like ISO or NIST or others, Center for Net Security, even groups like SANS participating in these groups. But over the years, I've heard this comment over and over again, even from SANS instructors or other people that I've worked with in the industry for a lot of years. And there's this comment that people have said that basically all of these standards are basically the same. And I've even heard people say, listen, at the end of the day, there's lots of good standards. If you pick something from NIST or CIS or ISO or wherever you pick it from, just pick one, follow it, and you'll be fine. But the reality is the more that we research this, the more that we spend time analyzing this issue, that couldn't be further from the truth. There are a lot of very good standards around the world. And I don't want this presentation to be viewed as negative or us criticizing anyone. I just want to have a realistic understanding of where these are. And in this edition, this is the 2022 edition, is we just want to give you data that's available to us right now. So we look where we originally presenting this. So as of right now, obviously this is October of 2022. Many of you may be listening to this on a recorded version somewhere down the line. We want to give you a point in time snapshot of where the standards are today, so you can make an intelligent decision about how you're going to spend your time and where you're going to be looking at controls and safeguards that make the most sense for you. Most often I'm seeing in organizations that companies are choosing cybersecurity standards based on popularity, based on experience, and there's really no sort of objective or main sort of quantifiable way of analyzing these side by side so we can make a better decision. And one of my favorite stories about this is I was working with a very large tech company out in California, and the CEO of the company had been invited to a state dinner, and this is under the Obama administration. And so the CEO went to the state dinner and happened to be sitting next to the Obamas during dinner. And so they're just having a conversation, and certainly technology came up, being that he was a CEO of one of these large tech companies. And they're talking about different things, and cybersecurity came up. And it turns out the president was very interested in cybersecurity, and actually one of his very first initiatives coming into office originally in the first part of his term. And so they were talking a little bit about cybersecurity defenses. And one of the questions that he asked is, he said, so tell me, so what cybersecurity standards are you all using? Like, do you have a particular standard that you follow? Like, are you using NIST? Or like, what do you all do to set your architecture? And first of all, it's super intelligent that the president asked those questions. But the CEO came back and said, yeah, absolutely. If we use NIST, then they kind of continued the conversation and went on to other things. Well, the CEO flies back to California, and I happen to be working with the audit group in that particular organization. And we're talking a little bit, and he was just interviewing us and asking us what we were doing. He said, listen, I just want to make sure I told the president the right thing. Like, are we really using this as a part of our standards framework? And we all said, yes, absolutely. That's part of what we do. And we said, well, it's not the core focus. We are using the CIS Controls with that organization. But we said, yeah, I mean, the NIST is definitely part of our mindset. It isn't really the focus. And he said, well, so was that an okay answer? And we said, yeah, that was fine. And he said, okay, good. And he's telling us a little bit about the dinner. And then so as we go through this, the end of the conversation says, okay, and by the way, what is NIST anyways? And the CEO didn't really know, but of course he didn't want to look stupid in front of the president. And so that's the way that he answered. And the reality is that a lot of times we're finding organizations have heard these buzzwords. They've heard NIST, they've heard CIS, they've heard whatever, but they don't really know what that means. And what I want to do in this webcast is I want to have an intelligent conversation about what does that difference mean, so that depending on your goals, what you're trying to achieve, you can make an intelligent decision, work with your leadership to figure out what you want to be doing to best defend yourself. And that's really what this comes down to. So with that being said, this is going to be something we're going to try to do every year. Like I said, we did this last year. This is an updated version of the content. You'll see a lot of the slides will be the same. A lot of the data is different and updated, and you'll see what that means here in just a minute. But we're going to look at the most popular cybersecurity standards. We're going to use a set evaluation criteria. We'll walk through that criteria here in just a minute. And we want to do a couple things. One is we want to be able to have an intelligent conversation. But second of all, we want to try to provide a methodology for evaluating these standards also. It doesn't mean you have to follow what we're doing, but even if you decide you wanted to tweak what we're doing, we'd be good with that. But we want to open the door for conversation. And that's the piece we're hoping to do here, so you can make that intelligent decision like I was describing. So for this study, what you can see is on the screen, these are the certifications, the standards that we use as part of the conversation. We did include some older versions because we wanted to show some differences. Like in a couple cases, we have some new standards or standards that have changed. And we thought it'd be worthwhile to show the differences between the versions. That way you could sort of look at those and understand how the actual standards themselves have changed in recent years. And some of these have been sort of additions to the document or to the study just because of some of the newness of this. So specifically, you'll see with the CIS Controls, we do include both version 7.1 and version 8. We do separate those just because what we find is that there's a pretty different scope. With version 8 of the CIS Controls, there is a new group of people, individuals who are actually doing the work there. So that's obviously sort of changes. Anytime you have a standards body that changes the people actually doing the writing, changes the mindset sometimes. And so we really wanted to treat those almost as different standards. So we've listed those out separately, and you'll see we'll analyze each separate. We've also added to this year's study the ISO 27002 2022 standard that came out earlier this spring. It's not been out quite a full year yet, maybe 6 months, 8 months, maybe now. And so the last major update to ISO 27002 is in 2013. And so you see there's obviously a 9-year gap there, kind of a big deal for cybersecurity standards. Obviously a lot of changes in 9 years. So it's good to see them release a new document. So we've gone ahead and analyzed those controls. Now, we're not treating this as a compliance requirement for 27001. We're just purely looking at the 27002 2022 version and the controls specifically listed in that document. So we're being specific about that. The other one sort of in the same vein is PCI version 4. That's another one that we've added to this year's study. Obviously, some of these like HIPAA or COBIT haven't really changed in the last 12 months. But when we look at the CIS Controls, we look at ISO, we look at PCI, there have been some pretty big updates there. We had debated adding CMMC in the drafts for version 2, but because that's in a state of flux, we decided at least at this point to leave it out. We had sort of a similar conversation last year as it related to 27002, because it hadn't been finalized and ratified yet. We didn't want to give false information or maybe based on draft information. So what we're going to do is we decided going forward is we're going to wait until there's a final version released of these standards, and then we're going to go ahead and put it into the research. So that's kind of where we're at with CMMC. Although obviously, if you look at CMMC, there's a lot of things going on in flux there. Looking at the levels, right, 1 through 5, there's a lot of changes be going on there, the actual controls themselves. So we'll leave that for a future year. The other thing that we did was when we talk about the collective control catalog later, the CCC is using a new version. There's a version that was released this summer. And so that's the foundation that you're going to see there, the 2022 version. So that is new as well when we look at some of these. So what we did was we went through each of these standards and we used a series of criteria questions that are there. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading these. You can obviously read a lot of this on the screen. Like I said, we're going to have more information here than we have time for to present. But what we did was we gave a grade to each of these issues we see here. So for example, we looked at control scopes. So we looked at coverage of operational controls versus privacy versus technical controls and spent some time there. We looked at how recently the document had been updated, of course, thinking, recent threats, that kind of thing being considered. We did put in there, is this a community-driven or an open development model? One of the things that we sort of thought about, we debated changing on here was licensing also. At the end of the day, we decided not to do that this year, but we are going to leave our minds open to that for next year. What we are starting to find is you look at things like high trust, for example, or we look at things like the recent versions of CIS Controls, there are some commercial licenses for use. And we've been debating adding that as a criteria. We did not do that this year, but we are looking potentially at doing that next year. So for now, we're going to leave it, we're going to ask the question, is this a community-driven process, which tends to lead to more feedback, more input, more up-to-date threats being addressed, that kind of thing. So we felt like that was a value. You'll see some things we did on Google Trends, look at popularities of standards. We also looked at, does the standard map threats to controls? Long story short, really nobody does, but we still felt like that was a criteria that we wanted to put in there. We wanted to look at modern threats, were those being addressed, or were these just traditional audit, kind of controls? Again, are they actually effective controls, or are they more just sort of a compliance centric? We wanted to look if there were mappings available, if they were tagging for applicability. So looking at things like cloud versus ICS, et cetera, that was something we wanted to understand. Whether this is something that was internationally applicable or was it just a US standard. Certainly there's a lot of these that are very regional. So for example, if we look at some of the Australian standards, or we look at some of the US state standards, or even NIST to a degree, there's sort of this mindset that it may be a little US centric or country specific. So we want to understand, is it something universally applicable, or really is it targeting just one geographic area? And then we wanted to look at things like, are we prioritizing controls, actually giving that score? And then is there a corresponding measures and metrics guide to help us if we're doing automation or figuring out how to do audit, or again, metrics around the control standard? Now, the idea is that we're going to go through and we're going to put in, as a part of this list, letter grades, because we felt like that was sort of the best way to approach this. So grades or marks, like I get in primary school. And ultimately what we did was, you can see on the right there, we went ahead and graded scores on a numeric scale, on a 1 to 5 scale. And then depending on the letter grade that we gave for each of these characteristics, then we turned that into a numeric metric. And then that quantifiable metric, then we went ahead and when we looked at the averaging, we used these numbers here to decide what the ultimate score for the standard was. So that's how we ended up getting a letter grade basically for each of these. And we'll summarize this when we get to the very end of the presentation. So the baseline that we used for controls was the collective control catalog. Many of you may have heard of this. It's relatively new, something that a number of organizations have been working on here in the past couple of years, really since the beginning of the pandemic. One of the projects sort of near and dear to my heart to provide researchers. This is the same group that made the collective risk model, the collective threat model, which is formerly the open threat taxonomy. Really an open project to research to give to the community so that everyone has access to information to be able to make better decisions about risk, about threats, about control selection, really just sort of a give back. And that was kind of the whole point of this project, is we had some free time at the beginning of COVID, and we asked ourselves, what can we do to really give back to the community. And we thought, well, are there things that we know need to be done that everyone really needs to do? And if we help provide templates for those, maybe organizations could focus less on the research or the theory and focus more on the implementation and the doing. And then that's what we wanted to help with. And the idea with the collective control catalog was we took about almost 40 standards. And the most recent version, we're already drafting the 2023 version. We'll probably have that out in the spring. But we used about 40 standards, just shy of 40, normalizing roughly 2,200 control statements from all of these standards into about 400 statements, right? The idea being, you talked to Tony Sager over at Center for Net Security, formerly the NSA, he always made the comment that most control standards are mostly copied and pasted from other existing control standards, and he's absolutely right. And so what that leads to is, as you have these different standards being published, is they tend to focus on the same controls. And ultimately, what seems to be happening more and more with these standards is this almost an echo chamber of standards. And the thought is that if I say in one standard that say, I don't know, EDR, endpoint detection and response is useful, and you see that I said that, you might be inclined in your standard to say the same thing. And now if two of us are saying it, then somebody else might say the same thing. And there is a bit of an echo chamber mindset going on within the standards world. So what that leads to is when you have these 2,200 control statements across these 40 standards, it's really easy, it turns out, then to normalize those. And 400, it turns out, is even a little bit on the high side. It's probably closer to about 300 in reality, but we've added extra statements in to cover gaps that we've identified overall in the standards. So for example, in 2022, we identified that there are really no controls in most of these standards about mobility. And especially with people working from home and using sort of these mobile devices to work more and more, and them being used to protect corporate data, we wanted to make sure that there were controls listed for that. And even though the 40 standards didn't have that, some of those 400 statements are addressing that area. So really at the end of the day, it's sort of probably closer to about 300 statements, but the 400 are addressing some of the gaps we found so far. There's a lot of groups focused on this or helping us with this. Certainly, we are not the only group. Certainly, the folks at Enclave and Audit Scripts are sort of a big part of that. The SANS has been a great supporter helping us with this. IAMS, Black Hills Information Security, Cisco, and there are many others. Right? These are just some of the names, sort of the first groups that have come in to help. So we got a lot of really good feedback from the community so far. Lots of people giving us individual feedback, and really we hope that continues into the future to make sure this is as good as it can possibly be. But like I said, right, the goal originally was we went through, and I'll go through some of this very quickly, but we went through each standard. Like, so here's an example. We looked at PCI DSS version 4, and you can see we basically went through the PDFs that were there and turned it into a document that could be parsed. And the idea being that if it's parsable, then we could go ahead and we could normalize the data. And the way that we normalized it was through categories. So you see control categories. So for every statement, we manually will go through and give a control category statement. Then under the control system, we tag category and a system to each of these control statements. And then what we can do from there is we can look at the controls tagged to an individual control system and then manually make sure that they map in properly. And that way, if there's a delta or something that's missing in the collective control catalog itself, then we can go ahead and address that. And so you can see sort of the format. We don't give these slides away or this part of the spreadsheet away just because it's raw data. And frankly, it's not easy to understand if you don't really have a background on it. And so we're just giving the content that's actually been analyzed. So that's the piece we actually give away. So part of what we give away then is a mapping guide. So this is part of how we did some of the decision making for the scoring that you're going to see here today. You can see we have the individual control statements on the left, and you can see on the right, then we go ahead and map it at a very detailed control level for each of those statements. So this built on some of the work that we did years ago with the CIS Controls and some of our master mapping guides and some of that. This is really just a newer version of that. Certainly a much more detailed version, a much more granular version of a mapping. Again, all this is available over at the Audit Scripts website if you want to go ahead and download that. So what we did was then is we used that as the foundation to measure each individual controls library or control standard against the overall control catalog. So again, if I go back a slide, so you'll see all of these categories over on the left. Like in this case, this is some of the governance controls that are there. What we did was we measure the use of each of these statements and these controls and safeguards that are here, and is each of these statements covered by each of the control standards that we see over on the right-hand side. And that's where we get these scores here. So just as a first example, so this will be the template that I'm going to use for a lot of the standards. And what I'm going to do is walk you through each of these kind of one at a time and be able to show some of the pros and cons. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to read every bullet that's here, but I want to show very specific, sort of interesting or nuanced areas that we learned going through this. So here's an example using the CIS controls, and this is version 7.1. I'll be version 8 in just a minute. So what we do is, if you look to the far right, the idea would be if this particular standard covered all of the control statements that all the other standards covered, then it would be, that green bar would be all the way to the right side. You can see that sort of faint bar on the far right. So the closer you get to that, the more coverage you get. And then what we did is we established some percentages that are there. And basically we just did color coding based on percents. So we didn't want to make a judgment call per se, is we just did a sort of a red, yellow, green sort of dashboard view. And then each of those colors is based on a particular percent number that we identified, just to sort of make it easier to visualize. It's not really necessarily saying good or bad. In fact, I've been talking to some user interface analysts here recently, and there's a bunch of reasons why we're not necessarily, a lot of people are discouraging sort of these stoplight views these days. Even if it's something as simple as people who are colorblind don't necessarily see these as easily. And so it might be just, that simple. So I think in the future, we're going to debate how we do this, and we may choose a different color scheme to go ahead and do that going forward. But we did this last year, so we figured we'll go ahead and leave the colors the same so that we have consistency. But for right now, though, again, we're going to use those colors just again to show differences and sort of help pop or highlight the differences there. So what we see is, we see a couple things. First of all, at the very last, I'm going to actually start at the bottom just to make sure I explain this. You'll see under data privacy that there's a very, very small bar there. That's going to be true of almost all the standards. And it almost gives the impression that there's something that's covered under privacy. But the reality is as we analyzed most of these controls, what we found is very, very few of the cybersecurity standards address purely privacy statements. They'll access things that are in support of privacy, like identity controls, authentication controls, access controls, data inventory controls, etc. But for the most part, they don't really address privacy. But we found the graph was very hard to read when we took that red piece off. So we have a little bit of red there. It makes it look like there's something. The reality is it's really 0% coverage, but we wanted there to be something there so you could actually see that on the graph. The other thing you'll notice is the CIS controls here are clearly a technical standard, right? If we look through some of these statements that are in place here, obviously when you look at some of the governance controls or audit controls, those kinds of things, like those just really aren't covered. To be fair, when we really looked at the CIS controls in the early days, Alan Pollard always told us, like, this is not meant to be a governance standard, and specifically told us he did not want those controls in place. Now, some still made it in, right? Over the years, stuff like this, nothing's perfect. But you can see, obviously, that was not prioritized. So if you were looking for a technical standard, this was typically a good place to go, but not really designed for governance. Not good, not bad, just reality. And that's the kind of thing that we wanted to identify as we were going through this process. So you can see that right away as an example. There's some other things in here too, software development, for instance. That's going to be a challenge for most all of these standards. That's definitely something we've seen as a trend here recently. You can also see here a little bit just sort of the conversations around the controls. You'll see we are using Google Trends for this. So we're doing this for all the standards. I'm not going to read all of these, but you'll see that there's been pretty much, I did a search in this one just for CIS controls, so it didn't differentiate between version 7 and version 8. What we see is about the time that there are sort of major announcements or those sort of things, you'll see a spike. But for the most part, you'll see sort of the same interest since really over the last 5 years. You haven't seen a lot, maybe a little bit of growth. Maybe this year, right, the average meeting is just a tad higher than what it used to be, but pretty consistent, right? So this project's been around since 2008. Really just sort of a consistent standard, almost like you see it as a wave. The longer a version gets, the less interest there is, but then when a new version comes out, there's interest again. So kind of a wave-based approach, and very consistent when you look at the sort of the people using this. But overall, again, I'm not going to read each individual score because this would take us, frankly, a couple days probably to go through. A couple things that I'll point out though on this, and every one of these I'm going to look at a little bit differently. Looking at governance, operational, and privacy controls, not the focus, right? So that they certainly didn't score great on those and this. But again, it's not bad, but it's just if you were looking for privacy standard, this should not be where you focus your time, right? That's the part we wanted to highlight. Maybe you want to look at the NIST privacy framework, for example, or something similar. The other one that pretty much everybody scores badly on is the mapping threats to controls. There's always a discussion that we do control selection based on known threats to a system. And what we've realized going through these is that honestly, no one really publishes that data. Now, is it being done? I don't know. My guess is probably none of the standards are actually mapping or doing an actual research effort where they map specific threats to the controls that are in place. So that was one thing, again, just to be clear, we think might be kind of just something to be aware of there.
All right, sorry about that. I'm just making a quick adjustment to my audio. Hopefully that makes my audio a little bit clearer. Just realized there may have been a bug there. All right. So in looking at that, what you can see is you can see some of those scores that are in place. Looking at, again, is this control mapped to other standards? Is there applicability that's tagged? Are there priorities that are in place? Those kinds of things. And you can see those scores. I'm not going to read every score in every one of these tables for us. It just doesn't make sense. But I will highlight differences or uniquenesses as we go through these, because like I said, there's a lot to cover. If we also look at version 8 of the controls, it's interesting because what you'll see is some of the governance controls get better scores. And so you start to see those scores, not a lot, but definitely a little bit of a shift up, whereas you see the technical controls all shifting down a little bit. That is another trend that we've identified in 22. With ISO, the new version, with PCI, with the CIS controls, there is definitely a trend to slim back the control standards. In other words, make the lists shorter. So that's definitely a trend we've noticed. So all the new standards that are coming out seem to score this way. There is a little more parity between the governance and the technical controls. It almost feels like there's been a shift over at Center for Net Security as far as leaning a little bit more towards those governance controls. Again, not good, not bad, not making a judgment call, just data, right? So you can decide sort of what you need from sort of how that helps. So it seems like what they're trying to do is they have, and again, this is just purely volume we're looking at here. So I'm not trying to get in prioritization. That might be a future thing we do. Looking at hygiene capabilities. And I think that might be something we're going to look at for 23 scoring model also. But for right now, at least, you'll see that that's here. So again, same scoring there for CIS for the trending. Although you will see a couple changes here on the overall score between 7 and 8. 8 did score a little bit lower on us here on our trend. We did take the control update recently. We did knock this down for a lot of the standards that haven't been updated in the last couple of years. This one was released about, close to 18 months ago. So slowly what we're gonna do is we're gonna give A's basically to people who have been released within the last year. But then once you get to like 18 months, 2 years, then we're gonna start lowering those scores just a little bit. So this one changed a little bit this year as far as recency. And that's true of a lot of them that are here. A lot of the same are true as far as mapping guides and applicability and things like that. One of the other differences we found is that with the CIS version 8, maybe just because it's newer, they're not doing tagging in version 8. They also don't have a corresponding measures and metrics guide like they did in version 7. We actually released a measures and metrics guide for this, but CIS did not. And so I feel like they should probably release one for that score to go up a little bit. I think those are what kind of have drug the score down a little bit. Hopefully that's just because this is a newer standard, relatively newer, but maybe as time goes on and more resources are released, you might see the score pop back up a little bit over time. We'll see. We'll see kind of where they go with that. But again, a lot of consistency theoretically there. This is where we start to see some of the big differences though. And you'll see here, for instance, that with the NIST cybersecurity framework, that clearly now we start to see that there are changes here. Now, in the CIS controls, you could see that there is this line between sort of governance and audit and operations versus more technical controls. But isn't it just interesting here to see with the CSF, how clearly there's an operational focus? So things like incident management, business continuity, those sorts of things. Whereas the technical controls are all much lower. So this is the kind of thing that we've been feeling for a long time, but uh, we haven't actually looked at this and really been able to put our finger on what the change or differences were until we did this study. And so what you'll see here is, again, there are a certain number of technical statements that are made, some governance statements as well. But if you're looking for comprehensiveness of technical standards, certainly this does not cover what you see like with the CIS controls, even just looking at these two as the first two so far. So clearly a pretty big difference between those. Again, doesn't mean it's a bad standard, but if you're looking at this as a technical guide or as an architecture technically, this may not be the best choice anymore. So again, just something there we can observe right away, looking at the kinds of control statements that might be missing there. Now, again, looking at trending, this is actually something that surprised me a little bit. And so when we go through here, what you'll see is that there's actually been a bit of an uptick this year in popularity and conversations around the CSF, which is interesting because when I look at the scope of the CSF, I would have actually thought that with the additions of 800.171 and CMMC, and then also what's happening with the TSA guidelines for critical infrastructure, that would have actually sort of chipped away at the number of people using the CSF. But at least from a Google trending standpoint, like if that's the main thing that we're going to look at, I mean, clearly it looks like there's at least a little bit of an uptick this year and conversations around it. Now, it may be because NIST is starting to have version 2 conversations. And so this could be as simple as, now there's more web content about version 2, some newer content, newer discussions. People are doing Google searches on it. So maybe that's the cause of the uptick. I'm not sure. So it may not be that the Google trending actually represents number of organizations that are actually using it. It may not be representative, but I thought that was an interesting trend to see just a little bit of a pop up there in that last section to the far right there that you see. So certainly interesting there. So again, you can see our distribution of scores. Again, sort of across the board, with the exception of the operational side, the operations controls, they did a decent job on, but a lot of the others, obviously, they didn't score quite so well on. We also see with the CSF, there's not as many supporting documents. So if you're looking to implement this, you're kind of on your own to do a lot of that work, which again, just kind of interesting to be able to see that. CMMC, again, this also you can see has a slightly more technical bent. Again, not really surprising to be honest. So the CMMC version 1.02, really looking at those level 5 controls, right, to be very specific there. We'll compare this to level 3 controls, or really the same of what you would see in 800.171 here in just a second. But you can definitely see that there's a sort of an uptick in the technical controls. So far, just looking at the standards that we have, it's almost like if your goal is to look at more technology-centric controls for defense, we may want to consider CMMC or maybe CIS Controls version 7.1. Like those might be the best candidates so far for the technical side. But interesting, you'll see under network device protection especially, that there's a bit of a lower score. And that's another trend that we identified this year. More and more, you're seeing the standards bodies not talk about network devices. And that was kind of intriguing for us also. And what we found there was that this sort of relates back to a conversation that I remember having with Homeland Security years ago, is that they had even pushed us at CIS to remove a lot of the network device controls, feeling like it was just yet another device and really not the target for attacks. I can tell you there definitely have been breaches that have taken place because of poor network device protections. And then even getting into things like network segmentation, VLANs, private VLANs, those kinds of things could also certainly be part of that conversation also potentially. But there is a trend I've noticed in a lot of the standards not to address network device protection. And even in looking like the CIS Controls version 8, they actually removed quite a few network specific controls like around wireless and those sort of things. So that's another trend we've definitely observed to this. You'll also see that software development, again, tends to not be the priority for most of these standards. There are a couple exceptions, but again, if you're looking for a software development model, this is probably not where you want to go. Same with privacy, although there are some privacy controls, again, just certainly not the focus. Again, certainly you can see a bit of a spike there. I do think this is probably about what I expected. A spike a couple years ago on CMMC traffic, and it's gone down since. I think once they started talking about the changes to version 2 and maybe not requiring external certification, I feel like this probably went down a tad. So you're maybe not seeing quite as much popularity. I mean, again, people are still interested in it, but I think whereas there's a bit of a fever pitch there for a little bit, I feel like that's kind of gone down a little here in recent years. So again, same as we talked about with the CSF, not a lot of corresponding resources, not a lot of implementation guides yet, sort of a lot of maybe third parties releasing guidance and consulting services and those kinds of things, but not a lot of those supporting documents like you might see at CIS at this point. So that's probably one of the big trends we see with this. Some other standards, again, certainly 800-171 goes right along with what we see with CMMC. And what we mean by that is, of course, the 800-171 was sort of that initial tool that the US government started to go to, right? So if we think about, again, this is horribly generic, I understand, but if we look at 853 as sort of one of the core original documents that have been revised over time, that eventually, starts to lead to the risk management framework, or the RMF, more people using the cybersecurity framework sort of at a federal level, state level. And then there's a shift with Department of Energy and now eventually Department of Defense to use things like 800-171 for looking at controlled unclassified information of data going to third parties. So even with CMMC and looking at those 5 levels, level 3 of CMMC is really just 800-171. And so that's what we see here. And then CMMC level 5 would be sort of an extension of a lot of those other controls. And interestingly enough, a lot of those CMMC level 5 controls actually came from the CIS controls. You can actually sort of copy and paste and see where they came from pretty clearly there. But again, 800-171 was never really designed to be a comprehensive framework. It was designed to be a bare minimum standard. And the thought is that, again, contractors would be compliant and not have a full set of controls in place, but they would have a bare minimum of controls in place in order to protect that CUI. So again, a few technical standards being the focus. Again, governance is not really the focus here. System protection seems to be the focus. And again, you see network device protection also very, very low on that list. And again, from a trending standpoint, again, this has been pretty consistent because again, 800-171 has been around for a while. And has been sort of a consistent tool. I think you'll probably see a lot of consistency in the popularity of this one, very similar to like the CIS controls and some of those, because it probably has a little more longevity to it, would be my guess. So again, we can see some of the standards that are, again, not a lot of supporting documentation. This score is a little bit lower because, again, it tends to be more of a lower baseline. So again, if I go back a second here, again, because of all those control areas being just a little lower and this being more of a bare minimum or do care kind of control library that we have here, obviously those are quite a bit lower than we see with the others, which of course reflects in the scores there, at least the top half of these scores as well. Again, not a lot of threat mappings, those kind of things, not a lot of tagging, no prioritization. But to be fair, I think that's one thing. Once CIS moved from version 7 to version 8, that seemed to be sort of a big shift now in the sense that really almost no one is doing control prioritization for you. Now, more and more, all of these documents have become really just documents where they're lists of controls, lists of good things to do. But when you look at those and say, okay, well, what should I be focused on? Where do I start? Well, then it's up to you then to kind of figure out where you're going to spend your time and spend your attention when you're looking at those. So again, that'll be up to you. Looking at the 27002, again, I'm going to go through these very quickly. Again, there's a lot to cover here. Again, interesting here that I really caught my eye with this tool. And then even when I look at the new version, again, so we'll go back and forth just a little bit here. So here's the 2022 version. This is going to be sort of new content, obviously. Notice the software development bar. Like that definitely caught my eye. And that was one thing that really surprised me. Now, again, if I go back to the 13 version, you can see the scores. And if you just watch it for a second there and watch us go down to the 22 version, you'll see across the board, you don't see as many controls in place in general. It definitely seems like they've tried to pare back the number of good things they're asking you to do, but you'll still see focuses on operations, definitely a focus on identity management, and then a focus on software development. And in fact, it might even be misleading because some of the identity management statements are really around like secrets and secret management, which one could argue would be more on the software development side of things. So it's just interesting to see ISO here It's definitely not. Like if you're thinking here, what is this for? If you're thinking the goal would be, say, endpoint defense, like I would say no. But if you're looking for a standard to be more software centric, more operationally centric, this may be the way to go. But obviously, when we look at this as compared to let's say 800.171 as compared to CIS controls, very, very different, especially when it comes to some of the technical defenses. So again, if you're looking for a technical guide, this is probably not the place to go. But if you're looking for guidance to give you inspiration on the software development process, this very well might be exactly what you want to look for. So again, the scope tends to be very, very different between these standards. And again, a lot of consistency, maybe not as much conversation around this over the last couple of years, only because the 2013 version has gotten so old, to be honest. My thought would be now that the 22 version is out, is that you might see an uptick in this, but because they waited so long, they may have lost some of that market share. So you're still seeing organizations that are pursuing this, but I wonder over time if the volume is just not going to be there. And frankly, again, if we go back and look at 22 versus 13, just not a lot of big glaring differences, just a lot of consistency, which is fine, but it may lead to a trend of, again, sort of a downward trend of popularity for this particular standard. So we'll have to see. It's a little bit of a downturn here you'll see with this over the last probably 2 or 3 years. Doesn't mean that's going to continue, but it'll be interesting to kind of watch that in future years as well. So again, you can see the standard. And again, a lot of the reasons why this particular standard scored a little bit lower too, I think, is because, again, lack of supporting documentation across the board and less information on the technical side. So that sort of hurts the scoring we see here as well. A couple others. Again, we're sort of getting to the end of our list here, and I've got some other things I want to show you. Again, we look at PCI version 3.2, and then, of course, the new version here for this year, version 4. Again, interestingly enough, not a lot of big changes. Again, if I go back and forth here, again, you just sort of let your eyes look at that. Pay attention to system monitoring and identity and access management, and you'll see those kind of come down a little bit there. It's interesting, network device protection is sort of about the same level. The best that I can sort of see here is that this is very similar in a sense to what 800.171 is trying to do, and that because this is a compliance standard that requires you to actually do all the things that are in that standard for certification, it turns out when you develop a standard like that, when it really is more of a legislative model, we'll say, right, or compliance model, you have to keep the bar low so it's achievable. And what that means is you tend not to ask for the hard things. So harder things like network segmentation or let's say application control, those would not be a focus, right? They're very, very effective, but they're also harder, and they tend not to make their way into these compliance-based controls. Although I do give PCI credit because what they've done is they definitely have done more around multi-factor authentication, which is definitely a positive thing, something that we want to make sure is sort of on our mind. Again, trending pretty consistent. Again, I think that's kind of what you expect on this with PCI, just again, over the years, people looking at different versions, but again, a lot of popularity there still. And again, you can see some of their scores. Again, a lot of these are consistent with some of the things we've been seeing in the last few. It seems like there's a lot of similarities just with some nuanced differences on the controller safeguard level. A couple of the ones, the last couple I'll show you here, tend to score pretty poorly, as you can kind of imagine. HIPAA has always been vague, and frankly, it's getting very old right now. I mean, we're talking over 20 years old now. So very, very few standards in this space for healthcare organizations. You can see there are some operational focuses and some identity and access management focuses, but you can see across the board, just really a lot of controls are missing from this standard still. I sort of been my argument for quite a few years that if I look at the state of cybersecurity across vertical industries, the vertical that I'm seeing the most pain in right now, or the most deficiencies, honestly, has been in healthcare. And part of me wonders if, even though they were one of the first industries to have legislation to really tell us what we should do to be compliant, because that standard was so low and the bar was so low, I wonder if healthcare organizations did just what needed to happen to get above that bar and then stop. And that's been sort of a fear of mine here for the last few years. And again, you can sort of see HIPAA as compared to some of these other standards, obviously is a big difference. There's not really as many standards here, especially on the technical side, as what we might hope to be there. especially when looking at some of those network defenses and those sort of things, just really not a lot of guidance in that space. So again, trending wise, I'm actually surprised that the trends are as high as they are. I would have thought this would have been sort of a sort of something that would have gone down. The only thing maybe I can think of here is because there are privacy elements, operational elements, non-cybersecurity elements, that maybe that's what's propping this up. I'm not really sure, but that's definitely something that sort of raises eyebrows for me. I'm actually surprised this has stayed this consistent over time. And again, you can see some of the scoring there. This one does score definitely probably one of the lower scores for a lot of those reasons we just talked about there. In addition to that, COBIT, again, very similar in the scoping conversation. If you are looking for governance control standards, COBIT is one I would pay attention to. Like, this is a place I would go and at least read this if you're looking for some of those statements. So again, they have that governance focus, but they don't have the technical focus. So I know a lot of auditors will use this, and a lot of auditors will use this to look at operational or governance areas. Nothing wrong with that, as long as we all understand this is not a technical standard. There are a couple of statements like DSS 5 and maybe one or two others that say do good network security stuff, but they're very vague about what that really means. So again, I'm not really surprised, but you can kind of see the scoring that's there. Again, there is a downtrend, I think, on this. Again, it's been a few years since COBIT 5 came out. Maybe not quite the popularity it used to be. So we're seeing a bit of downward trend there as well. So again, not scoring on the higher side for sure. This one definitely is on the lower side again, because of that governance focus. But again, if your focus is only governance, if that's your only goal, there could be some interesting resources here to look at. Two more, MITRE's enterprise mitigations. This is not control. We may add that next year. This is just their enterprise mitigation list, which maps back to their MITRE attack framework. So dealing mostly with technical things and mostly dealing with system protection. So this one is definitely system protection centric. It's not necessarily meant to be comprehensive. It's really more of an example, but I throw it in here just because it's one that we've gotten a lot of questions about. So I wanted to throw that into our list. Not enough data to really do searches here. So again, it's too new of a standard. We're just not seeing many people really using it. So again, that sort of says something by itself, I guess. And then again, you can see some of the resources there. The MITRE's enterprise mitigations was never really meant to be an overall control framework. So I don't think they intended to release a lot of these other guides and other resource tools that we could use to help us in that process. Now, this one, of course, is completely biased. We measured it against the 2021 version, but the 2022 version is very, very close to this. And one could argue that both would be the same, but just there's a couple of reasons why I wanted to leave this as 21 version. So I did that here. You obviously see all of those bars completely green. This is obviously completely biased, though, because the goal of that project is to be an aggregate standard. And in fact, it's what we used as the baseline to measure the other standards against, because it was the most comprehensive of the standards that we had available to us. So that is completely biased, as you can imagine. Now, the downside of any aggregate framework, though, is that it's larger, right? So if you have, like, say, 100 statements or 150 statements in a standard, there's obviously a lot fewer things to focus on. And so that might be a benefit in and of itself. Whereas this has about 400 statements, and that's obviously a bit bigger, maybe a little more unwieldy. The difference is, though, if we look at that from a trending standpoint, last year, we didn't have any data. So interesting that we do have data this year, that Google is starting to aggregate this a little bit more. And we're definitely seeing more interest in it, especially this year. So this will be probably a slow rise. I don't expect this one. I was honestly actually surprised just to see any data available. So that was good to sort of help the effort here. But certainly, as you see near the end there, over 2022, we are seeing more. And my guess is you're going to see this number pop up a bit. There is a lot more attention going on this standard. So wouldn't surprise me at all to see a bit more interest on those right-hand columns. The other thing then you'll see score-wise, the other thing that's completely biased here is, again, I've been on the team that sort of worked with this standard, and our goal has been to release ancillary resources to help you make this easier. So a lot of those criteria that we set, so for example, the idea of creating a measures guide, we did that when we worked with the Center for Internet Security. And so that had that guide available. And this has the guide available, but a lot of others don't, right? Because a lot of people aren't prioritizing that. So There is a bit of analysis bias going on here, and I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that, right? Just so we make sure that we're honest about the work that we're doing. But there are some things, like for example, mapping threats to controls. You'll see we get an F on that for this project. That's not a document that's been released. I think it should be on everyone's radar, but still the collective controls, like every other project, is not revealing that information. So that's an area that could possibly improve. Certainly, it's not a very popular standard comparatively to, like, say, the NIST CSF or something. So again, it doesn't score as well on that, but it does have better coverage on controls. A couple of other warts that are on this one, like most of the other standards, it does not have a heavy software development focus, which is something that probably needs to be addressed in future versions. Now, granted, no one has a heavy focus there, but it's something that could be improved. And so there's those sort of things that are on our minds as we're looking at what we might do into the future. So overall, this is basically what you see. And you can kind of see what some of those scores would be. You get a bit of a range that's in place. And what you have to think about is really, this is our criteria and the aggregate results from our criteria that we've picked. You don't have to take this as gospel, as sort of definitive and the only quantitative approach to take. But we wanted to throw something against the wall that we could use as a starting point for our conversation. You can take the criteria that we used and use them yourself. You can take the scores that we gave and use them yourself. Or you could add to the criteria or change the criteria or rescore, whatever you want to do. But we wanted to start a conversation both around what are the differences between these standards, and then also how do you evaluate a standard? What makes a standard a good standard? So we wanted to be able to show you both sides of that. And that's kind of what we see here. So you can see some of those scores and do a little bit of comparisons there. A couple other things in the collective controls that I just want to show you, and then I'll take some Q&A here. So again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to post those. I'm not going to have a lot of time for questions, but if you want to post those in Q&A, I'll answer a few of these here in just a minute. You'll see in the collective controls as part of the downloads, you'll also see that we did decide to do prioritization and tagging. That's something we're going to continue. We did that for the 2022 version. We are going to do that for the 23 version as well. So that's going to be another one of those resources we are going to provide to make it easier. So maybe you say, for example, all right, we are going to start with just the priority 1 controls because that's a good place to get started, right? So there's a couple of those things you might want to consider just to make this a little bit easier for you. We've also released a reporting tool. Now, the new version of the 22 reporting tool will score you against those 400 statements in the collective controls. It will also take the mappings that we have and it'll automatically create graphs on compliance with some of the more popular standards. So the idea being is if you have one set of controls and those controls are mapped to a number of other control frameworks, then you should be able to automatically answer one set of questions and then it spit out results for lots of different standards. So we've done that in the most recent version of the tool at Audit Scripts. I know a lot of you have used the tool that we released for the CIS Controls. We've also released one for the collective controls if you're looking for that as another resource. And with that, we've done the new version does have some of those mapping pages or dashboards available for you now where you automatically have those graphs in place. We recognize we sort of pushed Excel probably as far as we can push it. And probably what we're hoping to do next year is convert that to a web interface to make it a little bit easier and have it database driven. That certainly brings some challenges too, but that's certainly the direction we're going to go long term to make this easier for everybody. Overall, our goal is to continue to develop the collective framework and to continue to give you all resources comparing these standards to try to understand where would one particular standard make more sense other than another. What we're going to do in future goals, in future years of the collective project is we've already added actually mappings into 27002, the 2022 version, PCI 4 and others. It was interesting when we did compare those to the 2022 version of the CCC, there really were no new control statements. Everything in PCI 4 and everything in the 2022 version of ISO 27002 had already been included in the 22 version of the CCC. So it was really just a mapping exercise, but it was interesting. Same thing with the CIS Controls version 8. That was one of the more recent standards we mapped. I think we had like 1 or 2 statements we needed to add to the library when we mapped in that document. But as we go forward, we expect fewer and fewer changes to the CCC because, again, it's getting more and more comprehensive and people are mostly copying and pasting from each other. But we are going to include additional standards in the future version. We are also going to have additional content for DevOps and serverless architectures. That's one thing most of the control standards today do not score well on. We did not put that in our criteria for scoring this year, but we noticed that everyone is doing poorly on that. So that's something we're going to look to include in some of our research for the coming year. Again, hopefully all this will be available in next year's or the spring version, 23 version. And then we're also working on a documented audit framework and template audit plan to correspond with these documents, so that if you are going to use these as part of your approach to doing cyber defense, that we could give you templates for audit plans and those sort of things based on the controls that are out there. So again, just more resources we're hoping to provide people to make this easier for folks going forward. Going forward, again, for you to think about going forward is obviously you need to think about defense and where you want to spend your time from a defensive standpoint. So some questions I would ask myself at the end of a presentation like this: do we have a formally chartered program to address these issues? Do we have a common set of cybersecurity controls that we believe we should be following? Have we been assessed against that? Do we know what that looks like, where we stand against the standard that we set for ourselves? And do we have a plan to remediate the risks that we've identified? So hopefully those would be some things you could be thinking about going forward. For the sake of time, again, I've only got a couple minutes left here. If you have additional questions, certainly you see my email, and I'm always happy to answer emails that might come up, or you can email us over at SANS. We're more than happy to answer questions there as well. A couple questions that came in via Q&A. We did put in the SOC AICPA reporting in the spreadsheet. So if you look at the master mapping there, or the actual CCC itself, that is in there, but we didn't score it because frankly, we didn't see it used as often compared to some of these others. We might do it in the future, but that's one thing we did. Also, Cloud Security Alliance, that's also in the spreadsheet. We did not put it into the slides, but it is in the spreadsheet. So the data is there if you want to look at it. However, 853 Rev 5, at this point, we are not going to do. And the reason why is because of the pure volume of controls that Dr. Ross and his team have put into that document. The problem is once you map to that and try to show compliance with 853, then the scope of the project increases dramatically and almost to the point where it's unusable. So that was one thing that we wanted to be careful of. We didn't want that to be overwhelming for folks. We wanted you to be able to focus your efforts on the things that really mattered. So because of the volume of 853, and frankly, because of its diminished utilization, frankly, fewer and fewer organizations are using it with the transition to 800.171 and CMMC. We just decided it probably wasn't the best use of everybody's time, and it would be distracting for folks. We may find some ways to do some like separate documentation where we show how they overlap, but I don't think going forward, we're going to add it into the standard itself. Otherwise, it's going to end up being complicated for folks. So that being said, also the question comes in, are any of these bona fide standards, from like a NIST or an ISO? Yes, there are some groups that are in there, but most of these tend to be issues around compliance, regulation, industry standards. That's just the nature of what's out there. There just are only so many standard setting bodies out in the world. So NIST and ISO are some of the big ones, obviously, and those are all over the standards, and that's a lot in our analysis here as well. But unfortunately, there's just not a lot of those standards bodies really focused on cyber defense today. Let's see here. So the question is, since we've broken down each standard into 12 rows into different color bar charts, can we redevelop a standard that all 12 will have a maximum green bar? If I go back a few slides here and show you this slide here, when we look at the collective control catalog, that is exactly what our goal was. We wanted to have sort of an aggregate view of those controls, and that is what is in that document. So if you go to audit scripts, if you go to free resources, you can go ahead and download this, but absolutely that was our goal, was to be able to do that. So you'll see that that was something we did address. So again, kind of part of the goal of the research we have here. I know there's a lot to try to cover in an hour, and I appreciate everybody being here with us today. This is one of those things I imagine will take people time to sort of ruminate on, think about a little bit. We are going to post information from this webcast, the slide deck itself, You have my email. If you have any other questions, let us know. Like, we're more than happy to answer questions and maybe help facilitate conversations here. We just want to be able to bring this information to the world to be able to see, so people like yourselves can make better decisions. We're going to keep doing this research in the future. We'll provide a 2023 version of the same webcast, hopefully in the fall of next year. But we want this to be a topic of conversation to help us all make better decisions, so we can all focus on doing the things necessary to defend ourselves and not have to spend so much time figuring out what that might mean. So thanks everybody for being here. I want to thank Laura and everyone at SANS for helping facilitate making this happen, and look forward to seeing you hopefully at a future SANS webcast.
Well, James, thank you so much for your presentation and bringing this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. And for a schedule of all upcoming and on-demand SANS webcasts, please visit www.sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.